Let me begin by thanking all of you for being here this morning, because your presence is a sterling indication of your commitment to higher education. And I'd like to do three things in my remarks today to add my perspective to the questions you're asking. What should university boards be thinking, and what's in store for the next decade? The first is I simply want to underline the importance of your role as university governors, and perhaps redefine the role a little bit with you, or have a conversation about that role. Secondly, I want to explore 5 questions. I think they're particularly relevant, and they're important for each of you as governors, because you help determine the university's vision. Now, I know Ronald Reagan said, there you go on that vision thing, but vision is important for an institution, and vision will be a key metaphor in our discussion. So these 5 questions are, can we have can we have equality of opportunity and excellence too? In other words, can Ontario University see broad and deep? Broad and deep. Second, can we look outwards beyond our limits? That is, can we see wide? Thirdly, how do we embrace change and instill a sense of reinvention and renewal? Or can we see forward? And a fourth, which is really a subset of the third, how do we see things new in our approach to learning specifically? We've learned so much about how we learn in the past 20 years. How can universities apply this knowledge to the benefit of all? That is, how do we see things new? And fifthly, how do we see clearly within, in particular to ensure the student experience is at once stimulating, refreshing, and comforting? So 5 features of vision here. And the unifying theme of each of these, the idea of seeing, speaks to your role as visionaries within your respective institutions. There's one other thing I'd like to do in my remarks today. I'm so glad that Kevin has organized it, so we'll have a conversation and hopefully learn something together. Or as my grandmother used to say, stand up to be seen, speak up to be heard, and sit down to be appreciated. I'll sit down for the conversation. Well, allow me to start with that first theme, a few words about your roles as university governors. In my term, the term governor is not very useful. It suggests that you oversee or govern every aspect of the university, which of course is not true. And as a side, as Kevin mentioned, my first university I love, where at Harvard the overseers are actually elected, 6 each year for 5-year term from amongst the alumni. And they are overseers because that was the term that was used in 1635 when it was started. And Harvard has never wanted to go back to the Massachusetts legislature for any changes, so the Constitution has remained the same, and the overseers are overseers. A terrible term when you think of the history of that term in the U.S. But governor doesn't help very much, because you do have an overall responsibility for the welfare of the university and its students and staff. And I think a better term is trustee, because each of you is entrusted with an important responsibility. You're not paid for this work, and many of you likely do not represent a particular constituency, or if you do, faculty or staff or students, you put aside the specific interests and concerns of that constituency and think of the university as a whole. And you're on those boards simply because you want to serve the cause of higher learning in your province and in our country. So you're disinterested in the very best sense of that word. And the term trustee also invokes a sense of your responsibility for the ethical framework of the institution. The ethical framework, broadly writ, a duty whose importance cannot be underestimated. As a trustee, you must have a sense of the sustainability and endurance and a vision of the university's future in your community. When I speak of trust, I like to quote my friend Mark Carney, who once said, "Trust comes in on foot and goes out in a Ferrari." Think about that one for a little bit. Well, each of you is here early on a Saturday morning because you want to be more effective as trustees. And I want to applaud your leadership. You set the standard for the success of your school, and you set the standard for our country. Now let me turn to the 5 questions about seeing things whole and your responsibilities in crafting and living the vision for your respective institutions. D'abord, l'égalité des chances et l'excellence. Pouvons-nous avoir les deux? Is it possible to have both equality of excellence and equality of opportunity and excellence too? Ces 2 objectifs devraient être complémentaires et non être en conflit. En ce qui concerne l'égalité des chances ou l'accessibilité à l'éducation postsecondaire, Le Canada a travaillé fort et a obtenu des bons résultats. Dans ma vie, j'ai vu le nombre de personnes ayant un diplôme d'études postsecondaires passer d'environ 25% à plus de 75%. It's a triumph for our universities, this equality of opportunity. During my lifetime, I've seen university participation go from less than 25% to more than 75%. An enormous triumph for the Ontario university system. But there is a but. Not all the news is good. Post-secondary schooling is not within the reach of all. Some of you may be familiar with an OECD study that I like to quote. It starts out with really good news, and then there's the but. It's a study that takes the 32 or so OECD countries, and it establishes the level of education of parents in a particular society. And then it determines the degree by which the children of those parents have met or exceeded the educational attainment of the parents. And if you the study breaks the countries up into quintiles, 20% groups. For the first top 4 quintiles of the 5, for 80% of the populations, Canada is number 1 in the degree to which students exceed their parents' educational level. Wonderful equality of opportunity. And you kind of raise your hands in triumph and say, golly, number 1 for the top 80%, a rising tide lifts all boats. That 20% at the bottom is going to be up there as well. We're in the bottom third for the last 20%. So there are large segments of our population where the children do not exceed the educational levels of their parents. And that's a regressive step that is really very unfortunate in a country like that. Part of that is our First Nations, our Aboriginal population, but they're only 4% of the total population. So it explains something, a huge challenge for our country that we simply have to respond to more creatively. But then there's the other portion as well, where the great promise of Canada that life shall be better for your children than it is for ourselves is not met there. On excellence, let me turn to that. Canada likewise does well, but I think we can do better. And let me emphasize the importance of aiming high and celebrating achievement to create a culture of excellence within your institution. And the best way to do that is within specific disciplines. The university as a whole is too lumpy and too hard to measure, although that's the way they're usually measured. But one looks for the pinnacles of excellence, the mountains of excellence within the terrain, which is your institution. The emergence of a world-class community of researchers and creative minds in Canada is undoubtedly one of our country's greatest achievements of the past 50 years, but it's worth asking, do we as a nation and does the world at large recognize the talent that exists in Canada today? Are we celebrating the work of our leading scholars and the spirit of learning and critical thinking that drives them? Is their success being shared with and noted by the world? And on this, our record is quite mixed. As the Science, Technology, and Innovation Council has pointed out, Canadians are in fact winners of a disproportionately large share of global awards. We do particularly well in the fields of environment, medicine, and technology. These are important successes. However, when it comes to the world's most distinguished prizes, the Nobel, notwithstanding Alice Munro's wonderful triumph recently, the Wolf Prize and the Fields Medal, our country is underperforming. In the period from 1941 to 2008, Canadians received 19 of the top international awards in science, an impressive achievement, but lacking on a per capita basis when compared with the United States, our 19 versus their 1,403, the United Kingdom, 222 against our 19, France, 91 against our 19, Germany, 75, and Australia, population 2/3 of Canada, 42 versus our 19. Just a little side here, Howard Alper is the chair of the Science, Technology, and Innovation Council, and with Howard's leadership, we put together a Global Excellence Committee. Chad Gaffield, my great friend over there, is a member, as are the chiefs of the other 2 granting councils. There are probably 1 or 2 other people in the room here who are. And what we wanted to do was to be more professional and more thoughtful and more aggressive in putting together nominations for these prestigious prizes. So this committee established a list of, what did we have, Chad, 120, 150 or so international prizes listed, terms of reference, nomination requirements, dates, etc., circulated to all the universities and the research institutions in the country, and invited them to develop a plan in and around 1 or more of their stars for particular international prizes to be sure that the nomination went in and was very professionally done. and that if it's an international prize, it was supported by more than Canadians. The Japanese do very well in Nobel Prize and other competitions, and while a Japanese person may have started the nomination, there are no more Japanese names on it. They're international scholars who are leaders in that particular field. We had some fun because early on, under Amit's leadership here, we decided that Alice Munro should be there. And how did we manage to get her nomination in for the Nobel Prize? It's a little difficult because the Nobel Prize Committee doesn't accept nominations from the field. They invite certain people, such as previous Nobel Prize winners, to make nominations. So we had to kind of crack that fortress first. And the idea we had is you have one person or one institution, in this case it was Amit's institution, who would take responsibility over the next year to generate a really powerful nomination for Alice Munro. And that work had just started. I think a week after the committee had begun this process, we learned that Alice Munro had won the Nobel Prize. And so Amit could put his tools down and go to work on something else. And one of the members of our committee is John Dirks, who heads the Gardner Foundation, that does this extremely well. The Gardner Foundation chooses laureates in medicine, and of the 300 or so that they've chosen in the 25 years of existence, about a third of those have gone on to win Nobel Prizes. So they've been very good at predicting. So when Alice Munro won the Nobel Prize, it was announced, I sent a note out to the members of our committee saying that the John Dirks effect is working really well for us. As soon as we actually identified someone, they won the Nobel Prize. Maybe it's because we identified Amit as the chief that made it all happen. Also worth mentioning are rankings as global universities. As you know, there are a number of such rankings, so let me choose just one for the sake of illustration, the Times Higher Education World University Rankings. Here we see Canada with 3 universities in the top 40. University of Toronto at number 20, University of British Columbia at 31, and McGill at 35. In the top 40, Canada compares favorably with Australia, 2/3 of our size, the Netherlands a little less than half our size. But it's noteworthy that these 2 countries, with significant smaller population than ours, outperform us in the top 100. That is your country represented in the top 100 universities according to the Times Higher Education Supplement, and where the Netherlands has 8 universities in the top 100, Australia has 5, and Canada just 4. These rankings are not the final word, and I say again, the best way to look for excellence is you don't look at across the university, look for the pinnacles within, but there's something that we should be constantly aware of and using them as instruments to improve. They can help us be more critical about our institutions and how they're viewed from abroad. And they also point us toward general but important truths. For example, with 15 universities in the global top 20, I'd not want to bet against the United States to continue its dominance as a global intellectual power. One of the great triumphs of the United States is its higher education system. And just think that 15 out of the top 20 universities, according to the Times, are in fact American. And the Times is a little biased towards the British institutions. It has Oxford tied for second after Caltech, ahead of Harvard, head of MIT, Cambridge number 5, and Imperial College number 10. Those are a little bit home field advantage decisions, I think. In any event, we have something to do. En votre qualité d'administrateur, dites-moi, est-ce que des départements dans votre université ont une renommée mondiale? Misez-vous sur l'excellence pour étendre le succès et les pratiques exemplaires aux autres départements? Votre université pourra-t-elle utiliser les prix et les récompenses plus efficacement pour encourager l'excellence? Look within your universities to determine how it is that you discover, illuminate, and reinforce and celebrate that excellence. Because the wonderful thing about excellence within an institution is it's a very attractive, contagious disease. It can spread from department to department. You look at the strong departments that lift the entire institution, and that, I think, is an important conscious feature of your trustee responsibilities. Let me go to the second question. Can we see wide and look outwards beyond our institutions to the world at large? This is especially true for students and researchers who gain such stimulating experience and knowledge from international study, what I call the diplomacy of knowledge. I recently returned from state visits to China and Mongolia, where I was again reminded of how that knowledge is transmitted from one society to another, past and present. First, a brief history about a little known story of Genghis Khan's contribution to Western civilization. The beautiful thing about my job is you actually have to learn something. I think I've been to 27 countries now on visits on behalf of Canada, and you do study the country and you get inside it. And so I read two biographies of Genghis Khan, whom I've always thought of as a great conquistador that kind of swept across to the Mideast, down to India, Turkey, etc., got to Vienna, and there it all ended. And he actually disappeared from history because he did not want the history recorded. He wanted the institutions to live on in a different way. But he turned out to be a remarkable purveyor of knowledge and enlightenment. The Mongol conquest of lands, it stretched from the Pacific Ocean in the east to Vienna in the west, and he stopped at Vienna because Europe was in the Dark Ages. There was nothing worth conquering there. It was a civilization that was well behind China, India, Islam, etc. But Jack Weatherford, who writes this biography of Genghis Khan, says that he was responsible for the Renaissance in Western Europe. It actually brought Western Europe out of the Dark Ages. And he identifies 4 specific ideas that Genghis Khan brought to Western Europe. One was the stirrup. Think about that a little bit, how it helped men on horses to hold their lance and fire their arrows from their bow. Secondly, gunpowder. Thirdly, the compass. And fourthly, the printing press. And I could go on with each of those and tell quite a tale of how that transformed Western Europe. But this was something that came because Genghis Khan, when he conquered the lands, ensured that there was a circulation of ideas and a order within that chaos so that trade and scholarship could pass from one culture to another. Scholars are only beginning to unravel the complex nature of discovery and the way in which ideas spread throughout human societies. The notion that the Enlightenment may have been sparked, at least in part, by Mongol ingenuity may be news to us, but it is consistent with what we are learning about how ideas travel and civilizations thrive or fail according to their capacity to evolve creatively. One of my bad habits, my friend Amit will know of this, Mike is in the back of the room, he'll know about this, is I like reading, I read a lot, and when I have a book that I find has some new ideas, I usually buy a couple copies, and Lois knows this, send it to my friends, and at Waterloo, Amit, the deans used to complain to you, you know, the wretched president sends us this book, and I got to read it because I know next Monday morning he'd be questioning me about it at some particular meeting. Any event, one of the books that I found really exciting in the last year was a book called Why Nations Fail by Professor Robinson, forgotten the first name, and Professor Miskalou, who's at MIT, James Robinson is at Harvard. And this is a product of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research program on economics and societies. The thesis of these two authors is that those nations that are inclusive in their politics and economics, thrive, and those that are extractive in their economics and politics fail. Chancellor Merkel was with us about a year ago. I found her fascinating, and I, ever the student, kept grilling her about whether the European Union had just won the Nobel Peace Prize. Quite an achievement, 6 decades of peace in Western Europe when you didn't have a decade of peace for the previous 1,000 years. And she, a gallant lady who was a professor of chemistry, a researcher before she went into politics, was questioning me on how this crazy quilt country, Canada, with all of its diversity could work. How do you get unity out of diversity? And I quoted this book, Why Nations Fail, inclusivity in economics and politics as the plus factor and extractiveness as the negative factor. And I said it's not inclusive on the top and exclusive on the bottom, which is a 180-degree relationship. It's inclusive on the top and then extractive, which is more like a 145-degree relationship. And her English is very good, but she broke into German with the ministers with her and the interpreter, and in the next 5 minutes they came up with about 15 different German synonyms for the word exclusive to try to get an understanding of what it was. This history is interesting, but it cannot be denied that the success of Ontario's university depends on our ability to be aware of and connect with learning taking place around the world. A smart and successful nation looks outward to the world with confidence and respect, engaging in dialogue and exchange for mutual benefit. And we have wonderful leadership on this front. Amit Chokma chaired a panel on international education for our Government of Canada, reporting a little over a year ago, with 16 or 17 recommendations. Numbers about right, Amit? all very powerful, but to give us a new ambition for international education. I'll just make one quote from Amit's report. He said, "It's important that all Canadians embrace the benefits to Canada of international education. In the global knowledge economy, how we manage international education will affect the course of our economic prosperity as well as our place in the world." And I encourage you to look at the panel's recommendations. I understand it in my own family. I'm deviating a little bit here. I grew up in a little town in northern Ontario, Sault Ste. Marie, and by grade 10, thanks to the outward look of Harvard, an alumnus in Minneapolis, St. Paul, had contacted my school, got no response, and then contacted me through another alumnus. And so by grade 11, I thought if Harvard accepts me, I'll go there. And I got to grade 13. I did very well. I first in the 9 papers that I did, so my marks were fine. And I needed a letter from our principal. And the principal, who was a very good man and liked me, said, "I won't write a letter for you. I won't have you going to a second-rate university." And I said very respectfully, "Well, sir, I'm sure there are second-rate universities in the United States. This isn't one. This was okay." He said, "Well, you know, the trouble is you'll go there and you'll stay in the United States." I said, "I don't think I will, but, you know, with respect, sir, that's really my choice." The letter was not going to be written, so I went to the football coach, who was also the history teacher. He says, "Well, don't worry, I'll write the letter." He says, "You absolutely have to go there. You're far too big a frog and far too little a pond, and you got to get your head knocked off in the football field by people who are tougher and faster than you," and so on and so on. And he was quite right, but that interesting attitude that we don't want someone to spread their wings. The interesting part of the story is our family doctor was a lovely guy, McGill grad, Dr. Black, and his son was about 5 years younger, and he became interested in Harvard. He was a wonderful musician, and he went as an undergraduate, and today he's chairman of neurology at the Harvard Faculty of Medicine and head of neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital. His sister, also very bright, went to the University of Toronto and is head of neurology at Sunnybrook today. So two children from family. One went to the US and stayed, the other here. And the world is better for what those two children did. Plus près de chez nous, il y a une autre façon de vous tourner vers l'extérieur par les partenariats avec vos communautés, y compris les programmes d'enseignement coopératif et l'apprentissage par l'expérience. I was speaking earlier to some of your colleagues in the green room about if I had the wonderful chance to start a university again. I'm very traditionally educated, but I would insist on cooperative education, on experience with the practical world. Theory and practice going hand in hand. The most practical thing in the world is a good general theory, especially if you're constantly testing it against reality and adjusting it accordingly. And that feature of education is lacking in many of our institutions, that testing theory against reality early on as a young person is beginning to develop intellectually and develop their own sense of mission in life. I could go on at length about that, but let me move to the third question in the interest of time, and that's, can we see forward? How do we reinvent and renew our approach in learning to ensure post-secondary education is relevant? What is certain is that we must do so. Change is not only happening, as Kevin underlined, it's accelerating. I always try to tell a story to illustrate that accelerating. That's kind of a banal statement, isn't it? Change is all around us, it's accelerating. But it took 300 years for the printing press from 16th century on in Western Europe to reach a majority of the population. 300 years before a majority could actually read and learn for themselves. The internet, which came into our vocabulary in 1995, has taken less than a decade to reach a majority of the world's population. Just think about that significance of change. The impact of new technologies is already transforming the way we learn. The rise of MOOCs, modern online open courses, for example, is a factor in education today. Online learning will not replace universities, I believe, but digital communications can supplement our teaching and enhance learning for students and researchers. Thanks to new communication technologies, we have a whole new way of sharing and circulating information. MOOCs are just one way to take advantage, and we must all prepare for and adapt to change and find ways to harness to our learning. I don't want to leave this question of seeing forward without touching on fiscal issues, and perhaps in the question and answer period we'll get into these more, but you really have an important trustee responsibility of looking forward for the fiscal health of your institution. First of all, the budget and the trends in the budget. And bear in mind that we in the university are pretty good at practicing Keynesian economics, but we only read the first half of the book. We forgot that the biblical truths of 7 years of feast and 7 years of famine are real. And in the 7 years of feast, you actually do accumulate surpluses and prepare for the difficult times so that when the 7 years of famine or 3 years of famine come, you're prepared for them and don't find yourself in a perennial famine situation where deficits are continuing the trend and the debt is accumulating. You want to have carefully developed and disciplined limits with respect to debt to the overall revenue of the institution, so you're managing it well. Look particularly at pension and endowment funds. Those are large sums of money. When Amit and I were at Waterloo, what did we have, Amit? 1.2 billion or so in the pension, about 350, 400 million in the endowment. An eighth of 1% on $1 billion is a big, big amount of money. And they take very careful stewardship. And it's you and the boards who bring that forward-looking vision of the institution, of paying attention to those things with great care. And finally, I would say on that aspect of fiscal reality stewardship, in our conversation earlier this morning, we were talking about what would you do if you're started at university. Well, first of all, I'd try to find a provost like Amit Chakma and clasp him to my heart with hoops of steel, and a provost who would carry both academic and financial responsibility together so that you centralize that. There's no question of the authority for that. My second appointment would be a director of alumni affairs, and people say, well, that's pretty funny. Why would you have a director of alumni affairs when you don't have any students yet and you don't have any graduates? I said it's never too early to begin to develop your sense of alumni. My final words to graduating students changed over the years, and by the time I did the last couple of convocations, I'd been at it for 27 years, so I was getting a little more daring, and I'd say to the students, just remember one thing: who owns the university? Who owns the university? Well, nobody owns it, but I'd say you're its stewards. You are the people who've given 4 years of your life here, and with any luck, you've gotten a lot out of it. You have an organic relationship with this institution, so watch over it and improve it with your constructive criticism so it's better for the next generation, and make a gift each year, beginning now, within your means, so that each year you're consciously putting some money back into that place so it gets better for those who come after. That's your stewardship responsibility. And I guess as governors, you want to be sure that your alumni affairs department is really robust, and from that your fundraising exercise is very professional, very ethical, and very ambitious. I could go on about my experience in those areas where I've seen such dramatic changes in Canadian universities in how they have identified their stewards and have brought them back into the fold of supporting the institution. Let me touch on perhaps what's a subset of the imperative to see forward by asking the fourth question: can we see things new within the mind and in the way we learn? Let me share a startling fact. At least 80% of what we know about the brain we've learned in the past 20 years. The ability to image the brain, both its static architectural features and its functioning, has opened up a wonderful new fountain of knowledge on how the brain functions and how we learn. And I suspect that in the years ahead, those learning institutions that are able to adapt their method in ways we'll learn best will be the most successful. I'll tell a personal story here, and I'm always a little hesitant about this. Is number 2 daughter Alex in the crowd? All right, I can tell the story then. Number 5 daughter Sam came home from school at age 10, and she said, "I'm not stupid." And we said, "Well, of course you're not stupid, dear." "Well, the teacher says I'm stupid." And that caused the parents to sit down a little bit. And we had moved as an English-speaking family from London, Ontario to Montreal when the kids were age 3 to 11, and they went to French schools. They went into a French lycée, so everything was in French, and it wasn't possible for someone to sit down with them at the end of the day and help them along. And it was really tough. First 2 had to repeat their year, and then after that they flew. And we thought our last was really having difficulty with the language, so it was only when she came home and said, "I'm not stupid," they said, "We got something to look at." And we took her to the same wonderful child psychologist at McGill, Frank Green, who dealt with a lazy eye reading problem with our first daughter, which he worked out very well. He says, "This is a little more difficult. If you have 15 different learning tools, just for sake of argument, she has one that doesn't work and another that doesn't work very well. So we have to develop a mitigating strategy for those tools that aren't working very well. And then we have to strengthen the other tools that helps her to overcome that. And as soon as she realized she wasn't stupid, but that there were features of her mind that needed some development and exercise, and other features that she could play with, she flew. And she has finished a PhD at Harvard on how the mind learns. She works for her professor. Trust those entrepreneurial people at Harvard. Her professor is a senior advisor to the Secretary of Education on learning, holds one of the endowed chairs at Harvard on information technology and learning in the School of Education. He's formed a not-for-profit company with 40 people. He says, I won't have any more than 40 because 40 is all I can manage and know their work well. And they're young kids. They're my daughter's age, 30 to 40. They're bright as can be. And what they're doing is taking all we've learned in the last 20 years about how the brain functions and how we learn, and applying that to curriculum, to information technology, to tailored learning that is geared to the strong and weak learning tools of each of the students in a class, and it's absolutely superb. Let me just comment on one other study to kind of illustrate this point of what we're discovering. This is in The New Scientist. It's an exercise among senior citizens who had the result of expanding the hippocampi and restoring neural communication across the brain to that of the level of a 30-year-old. A mild exercise routine resulted in a cognitive boost and heightened attention span, both keys to learning. The implications of these findings are significant, particularly given the incidence of obesity and cardiovascular disease in our society. And as people who care about learning, we cannot afford to ignore these and the many other findings that point to the link between mind and body. We must heed the growing body of research on the subject of how we learn. And we should be in the forefront of that, because we are the most creative people about how we learn in the universities. So the fifth and last question is, how do we see clearly within our universities to ensure the student experience is at once stimulating, refreshing, and comforting? Comforting in the sense of being part of a supportive family, an extended family, where each one counts and each one looks after one another. What I want to emphasize is the importance of ensuring our campuses are places that students want to be, in addition to being places where they're challenged and stimulated to learn. Someone once said about one of my earlier universities, Queen's University, I shouldn't single out a university, but this is a real story, that it's an institution that is both a good and a great university. Great in the sense that it has academic aspirations that are very lofty, and generally it meets them pretty well. Good in the sense that it really cares about its students. It has that sense of extended family, and that's as present in the mind of the folks there as being a great institution. So it's not an either-or scenario. We must have both. The idea of looking in is quite key. We must not take for granted this student experience, the welcoming environment, because ensuring our campuses are caring and welcoming is both the right thing to do and the bright thing to do. So let me end by restating the importance of seeing things whole. I've spoken about 5 ways of seeing, but of course they come together in seeing things whole. That's an expression of E.B. White, who was the editor of The New Yorker and wrote those magnificent books that you all remember because you've read them to your children, Charlotte's Web, Stuart Little. It's interesting, out of children's literature, one gets such great truths, seeing things whole. And I guess that's what I'm really putting to you today. Are we seeing broad and deep and ensuring equality of opportunity and excellence? Are we seeing wide to the community, across the country, and outward to the world at large? Are we seeing forward and preparing for changes to come? Are we seeing new things in how we learn about learning, including the latest brain research? And are we seeing within to the quality of life in our campuses and ensuring they're not only smart, but caring places for our students? As trustees of Ontario's universities, you're making a marvelous contribution to our learning and well-being. You determine our vision, and I want to thank you, this one person thanking you for your efforts to do exactly that. Let me leave you with my 2 favorite lines from Shaw that really apply to a university, both lines. Some people see things as they are and wonder why. We dream of things that ought to be and ask why not. Merci.